Hello and welcome to PCG Live. Now, 2014 is already shaping up to be a big year for freelancers, with the European elections in May, the Scottish referendum in September, and new research showing that freelancing is the fastest growing sector of the entire labour market in Europe. We're going to be discussing what all of that means for freelancers with my guests, Ian Murray, Labour MP for Edinburgh South and Shadow Business Minister for Trade and Investment, with Dan Martin, editor of businesszone.co.uk, and with Sara Hodson, a freelance consultant trainer. Now remember, if you want to ask questions, you can do via Twitter. The hashtag is PCG Live. Let's start with you, Dan Martin, first of all. Why do you think that freelancing is the fastest growing sector of the labour market in Europe?
I just think more and more people are realising that they can go it alone. It's so much easier nowadays to just, start your own thing. The internet makes it so much easier to get in touch with people. And I think businesses are also realising that, with costs restrictions and the recession, I suppose, that freelancers offer a much more flexible option for businesses. In a sense, they're a lower cost. They can get them in for more short-term projects. So I think it's sort of the changing economy. It's just reflecting the rising freelancers is reflecting the economy as a whole. It's just become much more flexible.
Sarah, would you agree with that? You've been a freelancer for many, many years, and you will have seen the perception of freelancing change.
Certainly. I mean, my sense is that the whole thing about being able to make connections, being able to network, because when you first start freelancing, your biggest problem is, where do you get the next piece of work from? You've got the piece of work you've got now, where's the next one going to come from? In the past, it was about ringing up, knocking on doors, walking in. Today, you can email a few friends and your network's in place. And I think I'd agree with Dan, it's so much easier. And also people are more savvy about it as well.
Ian, what do you think politicians and businesses can do to respond to this change? Because there is, of course, a concern that while it's a great way to respond to the current labour market by going freelance and employing freelancers, there is still a concern that freelancers don't want to be taken for granted, to have different levels of security, etc., applied to them. So how do you take on all these freelancers while at the same time protect them?
Well, that's one of the key questions. There's no doubt the labour market has changed fundamentally since 2008, and more people have been finding it much more difficult to get into work, particularly in the high-skilled sector. So they've been setting up their own businesses. People tend to be quite entrepreneurial, and freelancing's part of that. So when you have a job insecurity overlay in terms of being insecure in work but finding it difficult to get into work, most people have been looking at their options, and freelancing's one of those options. What we have to do and what we have to make sure, though, is that freelancing, whilst it gives businesses and individuals flexibility, the word flexibility isn't used as a veil for exploitation, and it's up to governments and politicians to make sure that freelancers are protected, because we don't want the good businesses and the good freelancers to be undermined by people who are using it for exploitation purposes, and I think that's a real challenge.
So how protected do you think they currently are, and if you were in charge, what would you do to protect them?
Well, the most important thing about freelancing as an industry is that people do it voluntarily, and that has to be very clearly stated, because freelancing is about a personal choice. It's about going into the labour market in that particular way, and we see the scenarios that we've talked about in the run-up to this particular programme about the decisions that people make to go into freelancing. So we have to make sure that people who are going into freelancing do it on a voluntary basis. We have to make sure that businesses who are taking freelancers on appreciate their responsibilities for paying people properly, for making sure invoices are settled, for making sure there's the proper training and health and safety in place. If all those things can be done, then freelancing is a wonderful thing to do, but we have to protect against the exploitation where people are forced to be freelancers or bogus self-employed, where they don't get the protections in the employment market, they don't get paid properly, and their health and safety considerations around that.
It's interesting, you've talked about not being paid already, and that was a subject we were going to go on to, but it's reared its head already, so let's tackle it, shall we? It's something that a lot of people are very concerned about. Kerry Lane emailed in, not being paid on time is still the biggest problem I face. What is being done? Sarah, did you ever face that problem? And if you did, how did you get around it?
Yes, probably I'm slightly different because I have tended to work for a number of organisations at the same time, so more of a portfolio of activities.
So you weren't reliant so much?
So if one big client wasn't paying, the chances are there's a smaller client somewhere that was paying. Interestingly, I did tend to find that the bigger clients were the worst payers. They were slower because their mechanics took longer. And then every so often they would change their processes, and you'd suddenly get this letter which come out, had to fill out all the details again and apply for this and apply for that, which meant almost like they were putting a barrier in the way of paying you. But my experience recently has people have got better. Also, I stopped being quite so naive and do put in large letters, you know, payment due within 30 days. And somehow that does have attracted people's attention. It was a very simple thing to do, but I started getting paid faster.
Dan, is this something that you or people who subscribe to your magazine website, is it a problem that they face?
It's continually, whenever we do surveys, late payment is, you know, biggest challenges, it's the highest. And I just think the government needs to do more. Like there is the prompt payment code, which big businesses can sign up to.
So but that's voluntary? But
it's voluntary. So, and even if they sign up to it, you know, there's nothing on them that makes them do it. So I know that your colleague Debbie Abrahams has done lots of work on looking at late payment, and there's instances of businesses going out of business because of it, and it's mainly the big guys that are so what the government, whoever's in power, needs to look at is potentially imposing fines, you know, naming and shaming the people that don't pay, and you know, freelancers and small businesses are just scared to use the legal rights they do have because it's the fear of losing that big contract or even a smaller contract that, you know, can keep a business going. So I think governments, whether it's this government or whoever the next government, needs to look, you know, properly at, you know, imposing fines and publicly talking about the big people that don't pay.
Can I just, one practical thing I found is that where I was doing quite a piece of work for a client over a period of time was to do little and often, so invoice at the end of every month. And that seemed to help as well, because almost like they got into the habit of paying me.
And perhaps it was more manageable for some of them as well?
It may have been, well, they were big companies with government, so you'd hope government got enough money to pay you. But, you know, but I did find that was easier, rather than do a whole project and say, wait 4 months, and then bill it went on completion. That seemed to take longer than the month by month. So maybe that's the tip, to see if there's a way of invoicing smaller amounts and more regularly.
But actually, your first question about the rise of freelancing is quite interesting, because I think it's risen recently because the risk of going freelancing has been taken out to a certain extent because of the employment market. But you do have that power relationship between the customer and the client. It's sometimes impossible, if not very difficult, if you have one big client that pays your mortgage every month, to then challenge them about non-payment. And I think that's where the prompt payment code and strengthening that has to come in to make sure that relationship's controlled in some way.
So is that what you would do then? How can you strengthen a code that's voluntary, or would you go further?
Well, we have to look at how you can go further. We've just had a Labour Finance and Industry group who's been looking at freelancing and looking at things like late payment. Deborah Abrahams, the MP for Oldham and East Saddleworth, has put a private members bill which examined all of these issues. And I think we have to look at how that relationship works and whether or not there should be some government interjection in a regulatory framework that would allow that late payment to relationship to be better managed.
But what do you think? What's your gut instinct? Do you think we need to go down the road of fining people, as Dan was talking about?
Well, it's very difficult to say. If employers don't pay the national minimum wage, the legislation is quite clear. They will be fined for that quite substantial sums. It's just gone up last week to £20,000 per company, and will go to £20,000 per individual. So that's a real disincentive for employers not to pay the national minimum wage. Whether or not, in this particular sense, you would want to be quite so draconian about it is up for debate. But actually, I'd like to see the evidence about that and what the effect it has on payment of freelancers. And
also then there's the issue is, well, OK, your company's failed to pay me. How do I go about challenging you? Have I got to get a lawyer? You know, that's going to take up so much time that it's almost going to be more cumbersome than just waiting another 2 weeks to be paid.
Absolutely.
I think it's got to be really balanced.
Government could take a real step forward in this, and to be fair, I think local authorities and government are now better payers than they were before. But if they set the standard, then you would hope that others would follow.
I think there is European rules that you can impose. You're allowed to impose a percentage of the invoice, but who does that?
Yes.
You know,
In actual fact, I have come across instances whereby freelancers have imposed a certain level of interest with the rights they're able to do that, and it's delayed it even longer because it's had to go through the payment process again. So there is a real difficulty in trying to enforce those.
So a freelancer who hasn't been paid has then sent another invoice saying, well, I'm putting a certain amount of interest on this because you haven't paid. Have there been any successful instances of that anyone's heard of?
Not that I've heard of. It is European European legislation, so the right is there, but whether anybody's used it, I don't know.
Okay, well, on the subject of Europe, in the introduction I talked about 2014 being a big year. One of those things, of course, the European elections. On the subject of Europe, what do you think the European Parliament can do to support independent professionals? Ian, we've heard about that one instance. Is there anything else they could do?
Well, the labour market across Europe, of course, to create the single market is very important to the United Kingdom. And the first thing I probably would say is the United Kingdom has to be in the European Union, albeit a reformed European Union, because it's so important to freelancing, it's so important to break down those barriers across countries. So it's about making sure that the single market and the free market thrives. Freelancers would be a major beneficiary of that, of course, because particularly at the highly skilled ends, where they can travel across borders and create those linkages and those networks that were talked about earlier on. So it's important to make sure that any legislation that's coming out of the European Parliament to make it easier for freelancers does make it easier and doesn't just put another regulatory burden on either people who want to use freelancers or freelancers themselves who want to be able to take their skills to other parts of the European Union.
How do both of you, either of you, view the involvement of European legislation on freelancers? Is it something that you consider? Has it affected you? Are you aware of it?
Well, I've done work in Europe, but usually through a UK-based or an international operation. But then there's the issue of VAT. You know, if you're doing some work in Luxembourg, or if you're doing some work in Turkey, or if you're doing some work in Poland, should there be VAT on the invoice or not? And there's all of those things you've got to think about. So if it was simplified in some way, but it seems to go back to whoever's employing you is the one that sets the rules. But my sense is you can work across the borders, and there's plenty of demand for people to work across the borders, but how you get paid, again, is the issue.
I guess there's the sites though, like Elance, and the sites like and others do exist. Where freelancers can go online, and as far as I understand, they work is that they sort of hold the payment, and you don't even have to leave the country. So that's another thing that the internet allows freelancers to work across borders by using sort of sites like that.
There's a really economic boost potential because different countries have different skill sets and they're good at different things, and therefore if you can import the skills that other places are needing easier, then it's great for freelancing, but it's also great for the economy.
Well, thank you for all your questions that are coming in via Twitter and email. The Twitter hashtag, by the way, is hashtag PCG Live. Here's an interesting one. This one was emailed from Jane Armstrong. Sarah, I think I'll put this to you. Is there a difference between men and women in politics and business? Jane is asking, do the panel agree with her that female freelancers lack the confidence to push themselves forward like male freelancers do?
Ooh.
I'm glad you've got this one.
Yes. My sense is that women are more cautious about saying what they can do, and they're much more realistic in terms of what they can do. So a nice juicy piece of work coming your way that's slightly out of your comfort zone, women tend to say, oh, I'm not quite sure whether I can do it or not. Whereas a man would probably say, oh, yeah, I can do 3/4 of that. Yeah, I can do it. I'll go for it. It's like the actor who says they can ride the horse, and in fact, they can't ride the horse. They've been on a horse once. It's the same sort of thing. But I think women are much more concerned about actually living up to what they say they can do, and therefore they probably think twice before putting themselves forward, which may seem hesitant, but actually it usually means if you choose the woman, you're going to get a reliable job done.
I'm surprised by that, because I can see that in kind of your normal contracted jobs where perhaps some women might be reticent. But when you're a freelancer, isn't there a different incentive? If you don't work, you're not going to get paid, you're not going to be able to pay the mortgage. So my experience with female freelancers that I know, including myself, is that all of that kind of goes out the window when you become a freelancer, because you become a lot more tenacious. I think
I agree, but I still think you're more realistic about what you can do and what you can't do. And I think that's the difference. When I've talked to people, that's what I see. I mean, very able women doing fantastic things, and equally very able men doing things. But when you actually say, how did you get it? The men are quite more likely to have knocked on the door direct, whereas the women might well have gone through a contact or another. I think women are more nervous about being said no to. And actually, the worst somebody can actually say is no. But women get more, oh dear, why did they say no? Whereas a man quite often say, oh, they said no, walk on. But I don't think there's anything very subtle about it. I think women just have to be brave, because if you actually don't have any money coming in, it's amazing how brave you can become.
Dan, is this something that, again, the people that have got in touch with you, have you ever seen this issue arise?
Controversial one. Whenever we write articles about male versus female entrepreneurs or small business owners, it's always huge traffic. And one of the biggest debates is, do women need specific groups? You know, should there be women-only networking groups? Should there be? And you're on the, there shouldn't be. Whereas some women are very strong that women and men network differently.
Yeah.
I don't really know, you know, which study do you believe? But I think if you're running a business, like you've said, you've got to be out there. I suppose in a way, if you are a bit cautious, male or female, social media sort of helps with that, because you know it's a lot. You can pitch through it. I run outside of business owner, I run a photography company with my partner, and she's the photographer of the business, and we've found paid work through Twitter just by looking for a photographer in. And we've had paid work, and you know we've not really had to talk to anybody in the real world. So if women are potentially cautious, you know that's a way of, you know, making contacts if they're a bit scared about being forward. But as for the difference,
I don't think you should be doing that because you're scared. I think you should be
completely.
doing it because it's a way of, it's a route to market.
It's another solution,
rather
than
because you're scared.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your questions, which are coming in via Twitter. This one from Lorraine: how sustainable is freelancing in the UK with such a global competitive marketplace driving prices down? Sarah, what do you think?
Well, you've got to be the best. You've got to be good at what you do. I mean, my rules for myself has always been turn up on time, do the best job you can do, and make sure you're no problem to anybody. So, you know, that's the being late, forgetting your stuff, looking a mess, going off sick halfway through. I've seen it all. And, you know, people do that, don't get asked back. So it's about being at the top of your game all the time, and the work is there.
Dan, how sustainable?
I completely agree, but you've got to basically be an employee. So if you're taken into a business for 2 months or to work on a project, you can't just think, oh well, I'm my own little business. I can just sit in a corner and leave when I want. You've got to be that, like you're an employee of that business, that you potentially could get fired. So yes, there's competition, but the PCG stats show that freelancers are increasing massively. The opportunities are there. Competition's not a bad thing, you know, without competition.
If you look at the industries that the UK in particular are good at in terms of where there's a lot of freelancing, it is the highly skilled industries that we're very good at in this country. It's top-end stuff. We don't have freelancing in some of the more low productivity, low skilled countries that would be competing directly with us. So it's about driving up the economy to be a highly skilled, highly educated, highly motivated, highly productive workforce. And if you can do that, freelancing fits very neatly into that overall economic structure.
But again, not going about the government again, but the government have got a role to play in supporting freelancers. You know, my site's for startups and small businesses, and freelancers are a part of that. But all of the government schemes that the government launches, all governments launch, I keep saying that, you know, they don't necessarily appeal to freelancers. Freelancers don't necessarily feel that they're part of these initiatives. So maybe the government starts to start using the words freelancers, contractors, you know, so that freelancers can access, you know, these schemes that other small businesses again.
Sarah, as I said before, you've been a freelancer for many years, and you will have seen so many things about it change, the perception, the opportunities, everything. Neil Adams has emailed a question to you, which is, what is the biggest issue you face as a freelancer? And I'll be interested to know what your answer is to that today and what it might have been 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay, when I originally started, the biggest issue of being a freelancer is somebody assumes you've lost your job. So you would say, they would meet you and say, what do you do? Oh, well, I'm self-employed, because you didn't say freelance, it's self-employed. And they'd look away, you know, sorry face, and move on. So that was the biggest issue, convincing people you had a real product that you were good at selling. Nowadays, I think it's all there, but there are still what I would call the charlatans. And, you know, if you're bidding for a piece of work and you say your fee, let's say, is 500 a day, you can be sure there's somebody bidding for that work who'll say their fee is 250 a day. Now, it's the client's got to choose whether you're value for money or not at that point. So to me, it's more about being able to demonstrate value for money. And yes, the fees are being pushed down because of more competition. But my experience is the bottom end, dare I say at the bottom of the market, is full of people who are not as professional as they could be, haven't got the experience, don't know how to handle the client, particularly don't know how to handle senior people on the ground in the other organisation that they're with, because they haven't had that exposure of dealing with people. And also probably don't have the, well, I go back to don't have the networks, but...
you know, the last point there, I'm just trying to clarify, are you talking about a kind of lack of experience, professionalism? What is it exactly?
I think some people get into roles where, let's say in the government, where they are actually going to have access to quite senior civil servants or quite senior members of the government or MPs and stuff, and they actually haven't really thought through how they behave, how they act, how they talk to those people. They sort of don't realise that those people are your potential clients. They are your clients. You've got to deal with them in a respectful, professional way. And I think some people underestimate that whole thing around presentation and just the way you go about doing your business.
I think there's a key point in terms of some industries, though, that are particularly using freelancers. Take the media industry, for example, and it's a key point that you make, because the only way into some of these industries is to be a freelancer, and the only way you can be a freelancer is to either give up a paid job that pays the mortgage and give you security, or compete in almost a race to the bottom with some people who are so desperate to get into the industry that they will work for sometimes nothing, maybe £50 a day. And the people who do have the experience and have been doing it for a long, long time are almost priced out of the marketplace. So it's about making sure people are educated about that best value, but also looking at the quality of what you can get as well. The media industry is prevalent of people just going in there and saying, what's X offered you, I'll offer you half to get the work and to get the CV.
And that's the downside to the sites like Elance, because it means anybody can just post, you know, I'll do your SEO for 50 quid. And a business might go, oh, I'll do that. But then the business gets in trouble because they've got a poor service.
And actually, again, sometimes my experience is that actually pitching low isn't always the best answer. Because if people think they want to get value for money, they actually want to buy the best quality. And sometimes they realise you pay a bit more for that.
Is that true, though? You know, I mean, we're out of the recession now, but over the last couple of years, would that have been the case when businesses themselves were a bit stretched? Would they actually have been looking to, you know, not so much value for money, but the cheapest, but the best?
Well, it's how do you judge the cheapest and the best? If you're bringing somebody in to work with you for 6 months, you won't know whether the cheapest was the best till the end of the 6 months. The sort of business I'm doing, if you're been running workshops and training courses, you can get feedback very much more quickly. And certainly, I've had experiences where, yes, I've been, as it were, somebody has taken the role that I've had in a client company, and then a year later they've come back to me to say, and the anecdotal evidence with the people was, oh, they weren't much good. So that's only my experience, but I think that happens quite a bit.
Well, we've looked at a lot of issues from the point of view of a freelancer, which is what we're here to do. But this question is more from the point of view of businesses, and this one's to you, Dan. It's from Jessica Richardson. Do businesses need more support in how to engage with freelancers?
Probably. I mean, some, I suppose, don't realise that they're available. If you're, particularly my audience, the majority have had under 10 staff, lots of them have none. One of the biggest challenges when you run a business is that first employee. So, you know, you realise you could grow, you can employ a staff, but you have no idea how to do it. So obviously a freelancer could potentially offer an easy way into that, you know, workforce. It's a more short-term thing. But yeah, I think employing staff, whether they're full-time or part-time or freelance, is a huge issue that businesses do need support with, because it is one of the biggest challenges that startups and small businesses face. And again, it's about offering, you know, whoever it is, giving, you know, easy HR advice, making sure employment regulations don't prevent a small business employing somebody, having, you know, websites where people can find freelancers, maybe encouraging small businesses again to use, you know, social media to make connections. But going back to, I think employing a staff member is one of the biggest challenges that small businesses face.
It's very good value for money for businesses. I ran my own businesses before being elected, and when we were doing some one-off pieces of work, it was great to be able to buy that experience in. So on the basis that businesses can use freelancers to benefit themselves is fantastic, and they should be encouraged to be using freelancers, as long, of course, as we talked about at the very start of this particular piece, that the exploitation is not used as an excuse to employ people flexibly, but proper freelancing employment is the way we should be going.
Yeah, I'd like to, if we have time, we've got 5 minutes left, to come back to the issue of social media, because a lot of people have spoken about how that has been a real boon to their freelance career. But I do want to talk about Scottish independence, because we talked at the top about the European elections, and also there is obviously the independence referendum. 150,000 freelancers, almost 300,000 self-employed people operating in Scotland who may be affected if Scotland becomes independent. Jonathan Littlewood has emailed, "I'm a freelancer in Manchester. I work with a lot of clients in Scotland. What will happen to me if Scotland goes independent?" What do you think?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, because we don't really know some of the key issues. We talked about the European Union earlier and some of the issues that arises from that. We don't know what the currency would be in an independent Scotland. We don't know if Scotland will be in the European Union, and if so, under what circumstances. We don't know about the free movement of people. If there's a different relationship in terms of Scotland and England, will there be a border? I think business and freelancers just want certainty, and they want things to be as easy as possible, whether it be a regulatory environment, a tax environment, a currency environment. As soon as you build one barrier, it makes it much more difficult, much more complicated, much more costly, not just for business but for freelancers. And therefore, when the world's getting smaller and smaller, as we've spoken about already, you want to be bringing those barriers down rather than building them up.
So, but if there was clarity on all those issues, it wouldn't necessarily be, and you know, the clarity was what people wanted, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. People's businesses could still continue to operate.
Well, that is true, but we need answers to the questions before we can assess that. People are being asked, and the person who's emailed in or tweeted in has asked a question about someone who lives in Manchester. They don't get a vote in this particular referendum, and therefore we have to be looking at whether or not, if Scotland decides to vote yes, which is only 6 months away or less than 6 months away, what the impact will be on individuals and businesses. And until we know the answers to those questions, then we can merely speculate, and my speculation would be until we know about the EU, till we know about currency, till we know about free movement of people, till we know about the way business would operate. Unfortunately, I can't answer that question from your colleague from Manchester.
Is it something that concerns either of you two? Dan? People who get in touch with your website?
I completely agree with Ian. It's the answer. I think that nobody really knows. You know, there's the lots of the debate that we see just seems to be just political mudslinging. You know, vote yes, vote no. But there doesn't seem to be any sort of serious. If you're running a small business in Edinburgh, this is how it will affect you. So some are probably not really thinking about it because they've got more short-term things to think about. But I think we need clarity, like on what will happen, particularly on regulation and currencies. Right.
Just in the last couple of minutes, then let's talk about not just, but about social media and just other ways that perhaps freelancers may not have thought about how they can get work and how businesses can get work too. Now, Dan, you talked about social media.
Yeah.
For someone who perhaps, you know, isn't on social media, but who may watch this later, are they missing out as a freelancer?
Oh, completely. Everybody, if you're in business, whatever you're doing, you should be on social media. I've been on Twitter since 2008, and it changed my life. Well, I mean, I've got jobs through it and worked through it, and as a journalist, it's an amazing source of contact.
So how have you got jobs through it? Just by tweeting people directly?
It's all about who you follow. So you don't just, if you're just using it for personal, follow whatever celeb you want. But if you're using it for work, you know, be savvy on who you follow. So follow the people that are relevant to you, the people you want work from, the people that might be good contacts. And going back to the business that I run, the photography business, that was purely a case of going to search.twitter.com and putting in, we're based in Bristol, and putting in photographer Bristol. And we found a tweet that said, I need a photographer in Bristol tomorrow, can anyone help? And we tweeted and got the job. Now, I know that's not the way to run a business completely, but all I did was search, and we got a paid job about it. So it's, you know, you don't even necessarily have to be tweeting much. It's all about, you know, it's all about monitoring the conversation.
There's got to be a bit of caution as well. I mean, I think a political career or business could be ruined within about 8 characters on social media. So you do have to have a little bit of self-restraint, yes, and you have to make sure that you're using it as a business tool that you would use any other business tool with in that professional manner that we spoke about earlier.
Can I just run a final word? For me, it's about keeping the people contact, well, the human contact, because it's too easy to just go in on LinkedIn or go in on Facebook or go in on Twitter, whatever it is. But actually ringing up somebody, dropping them a line that says, how are you, every so often. Because I had feedback from one of my major clients once that I wasn't keeping in touch as regularly as some of my people who were competing for the same pieces of work as me. And that was a very good little thing. I thought they knew me, they knew where to come. But actually, I was told I wasn't doing it enough.
Yeah, it is also, I've had personal experience of this, just the fact that you pop into someone's head because you've sent some kind of communication. Well, thank you to all of you for today's discussion. Thank you to Ian Murray, to Dan Martin and to Sara Hodson. Thank you to you for sending in your tweets on PCG Live. There will be another discussion, which you can watch on the website, and that's next Wednesday, the 19th at 12:30. But in the meantime, goodbye.